trying to wash down my allergies.
Well, welcome everybody to the Summer Sizzlers. We're going to get started in a few minutes as people get, oops, don't want to get ahead of myself, get logged in. Well, welcome everybody to our Summer Sizzlers series. This is number 3 in our series. I'm David Preziosi, Executive Director of Preservation Dallas, and I'll be running the show tonight. Irene is not with us tonight because she's getting her college freshman moved into her new dorm this evening. So I will be handling the show for us tonight. So I'm very pleased tonight to have Renee Schmidt here, who will be doing our presentation, a very interesting presentation that we have tonight. Renee is one of our wonderful preservationists here in Dallas. He lives over in Junius Heights and has been involved with the Junius Heights organization all the way since the mid-90s. He's the president, has worked on the tour. He's also on the Friends of the Aldrich House board. And then this year he received our Dorothy Savage Award from Preservation Dallas for all of the preservation work that he's done over the years. So now I'm going to turn it over to Renee to get our program started. Please, if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and type them into the Q&A feature down in the bottom of the screen, the little blurb, that says Q&A. Go ahead and just type it in there, and then we'll ask Renee those questions at the end of the presentation. And so he will be able to answer your questions. And I'd also like to say that our Summer Sizzlers series this year is being sponsored by McCoy Collaborative. So we're so appreciative of their support for this wonderful series that we have. So now I'd like to turn it over to Renee to get it started.
Thank you, David. The body of Mrs. Hugh Perry, Alice, as she was known to her friends, was discovered in a lonely ravine in Trinity Heights by two boys hunting rabbits on Thanksgiving morning, 1915. Her body was laid out peacefully, and there was no sign of a struggle. Her arms were folded across her chest, and she was wearing the same clothes that she had on 10 days earlier. She was dressed in a dark tailored suit, still wearing this black turban hat she had purchased downtown on that fateful day. One of her stockings was worn inside out, the same mismatch that was noticed the last time she was seen alive. Next to her body was the bag of pecans that she bought that day. At her feet were a pair of lady slippers, one dangling from her foot. The police were baffled. There was no sign of a struggle. Sheriff W.K. Reynolds believed it was murder. Detective Charles Gunning thought differently and was convinced there was no foul play. The police ordered her stomach, liver, and kidney removed to check for poison. Was it a murder or was it suicide? Alice's aunt, Mrs. W.C. Paget, admitted that her niece had been particularly nervous of late. A neighbor recalled that Alice had not seemed to be altogether like herself and blamed it on the last storm in Galveston. But no, suicide was out of the question. Mrs. E. Garner, her close friend of 23 years, said that Alice called her up the day she disappeared and invited her to go shopping downtown. Mrs. Garner said she didn't have time, but recalled she was bright and as cheerful as she could be. Alice's sister-in-law, Mrs. W.L. Perry, likewise scoffed at the suicide theory. She shared a letter that Alice mailed the day she disappeared. It was filled with joy at the anticipation of going on a shopping trip downtown. I haven't bought any new clothes yet, she wrote. Mamie and I are going downtown today, and it does no harm to look. This is a map that shows the route of the Jefferson Avenue streetcar, the route that she took on that fateful day. The red dot indicates the apartment where Mrs. Perry lived. While downtown, she bought a small black turban hat and a bag of pecans. At 2:30, she excused herself from her sister, claiming she had an appointment to meet somebody. Some witnesses recalled seeing her on Elm Street about an hour later. That was the last time she was seen alive. Her husband reported her missing the next morning. When she was found 10 days later, the authorities estimated she had been dead for 2 days. Analysis of her stomach showed it was empty. She hadn't eaten for some time. Where had she been for over a week? Where had she gone? Police eventually concurred that a robbery and a subsequent murder had taken place, especially when Dr. E.W. Lomos found a 2-inch blood clot on her brain. He theorized that the rupture was caused by a quick strangulation. Police later speculated that the purse, the pecans, as well as a watch and one diamond ear screw may have been left by the killer to make it look like a suicide. Alice was wearing a lot of expensive gems the day she disappeared. When her body was discovered, most of the jewels were gone. Diamond rings, an ear screw, and a brooch. And it wasn't costume jewelry. It was worth about $500 in 1915 currency, or over $10,000 today. She was still wearing a watch with a diamond-studded monogram, but that was concealed beneath her clothing, so a thief could have missed it. A small purse containing $1.20 was by her side, about $25 in today's currency. There were 2 handkerchiefs around her neck that had an embroidered T. There was also a smaller handkerchief with a T on it in her purse. The significance of the T was never established. The face was scratched, and there was a bruise over the left eye. Based on the soil samples on her shoes, police concluded she may have walked over to Trinity Heights to meet somebody in that lonely destination. A motorman for the Trinity Heights streetcar, Mr. L.E. Phillips, told authorities that a woman meeting the description, to a degree, of Mrs. Hughes, got off the streetcar between the Santa Fe and the Cedar Bridges, about 2 miles from where the body was found on Tuesday, a day after she was last seen downtown. The motorman noticed her diamonds. He warned her not to get off at that location, but she was insistent. However, when he was asked to identify the body, he could not definitely say it was the same woman who got off his streetcar. The motorman and a conductor of the Waco Interurban Line, TC, and H.B. Parker recalled picking up a woman matching Alice's general description. They picked her up Monday night in Waxahachie on the route to Dallas. They remembered her as being very nervous. She got off at the Monroe stop to catch the Trinity Heights car. When they were asked to identify the body, they also could not positively identify it. There were two shadowy letters that added drama to the case. An anonymous letter sent to the police in February 1916 promised that if a certain chauffeur were arrested, he could give valuable information on the murderer. As it turned out, it was a setup, and the chauffeur knew nothing of the case. In April of 1916, a mysterious letter was discovered folded beneath the controller box of a streetcar that gave the name of a woman who could help solve the murder. That, too, was a false lead. Alice was a well-known worker at Christ Episcopal Church, one located at the top of a hill close to the heart of Oak Cliff. Parishioner Dorothy Phillips Fry wrote in her diary on November 25th, 1915. Mrs. Hugh Perry, who goes to our church, disappeared 10 days ago, and today she was found strangled to death on a creek way out in Trinity Heights. Mrs. Hugh Perry's funeral was November 29th, 1915, the first Sunday in Advent. Because of the intense public curiosity in her death, an anonymous reporter visited the church on Sunday morning and took copious notes. These are some of the reporter's observations. The tragedy of Mrs. Perry's death, which envelopes the entire city, is especially poignant at Christ Church. The congregation discussed it in little groups before the sermon, and the Reverend Whaling's first words recalled it. Reverend Whaling's is tall, with gray curly hair and expressive face. His voice is vibrant, though a bit nervous in his delivery, and he carries the impression of intense earnestness and complete conviction. He gestures freely and vigorously. Then came the order for communion. During this part of the liturgy, the priest chants the 10 Commandments. Between them, the congregation sings, "Lord, have mercy on us and incline our hearts to keep this law." A solemn hush came over the congregation when Reverend Whaling, in a voice tense and vibrant, chanted the 6th commandment. "Thou shalt do no murder." Mrs. Perry's funeral followed that afternoon at 4 o'clock at the church. That was one of the Reverend Whaling's last official acts at Christ Church. She was buried at the Oak Cliff Cemetery Police speculated that the case of Mrs. Hugh Perry would end up like that of Florence Brown, a sensational unsolved murder that occurred 2 years earlier. And who was Florence Brown? In 1953, 40 years after her death, her murder in 1913, the Dallas Morning News began a new Sunday feature page that promised to, quote, crackle with excitement, end quote. The opening installment was advertised as featuring, quote, the famous unsolved murder of Florence Brown, end quote. But who really was Florence Brown? She was an active member of McKinney Avenue Baptist Church and was an energetic participant in circles and aid societies of that church. She was also on the business girls team of the YMCA, where it was thought she would participate on Sundays for club purposes such as, quote, writing, singing, receiving friends, and use of the stereopticon for educational and amusement intent, end quote. She was the woman who made appearances at dinner clubs, graced with hand-painted place cards, at church-sponsored picnics and lawn socials. Never a bride, she was the willing personality who helped others celebrate life's milestones, serving refreshments after weddings, hosting a bride's dinner, being an official bridal toast mistress, or by assisting at the bride's table. Her crowning public achievement seems to be a stock speech she delivered 19 days before her death at the YMCA on, quote, what the YMCA club means to me, end quote. In short, Florence Brown led a quiet, productive, yet unremarkable life. That is, until the day she was murdered. Florence Brown woke the Monday morning of July 28, 1913, to a Dallas that promised temperatures in the upper 90s. That, along with the weekend thunderstorm that dumped an inch of rain on Dallas, must have made the air particularly sultry. The previous day, Sunday, being a handmaiden of her beloved McKinney Avenue Baptist Church, she attended services there. She undoubtedly felt pride at being a congregant and a choir member there. The church had completed a major renovation 3 months earlier and was one of Dallas's early mega churches. It seated more than 1,000 people with its soaring 3 stories and featured imposing columns. It would host her funeral 4 days later. On that fateful Monday morning in 1913, she was picked up for work by Mr. S. H. Culberson. They both worked at her uncle's business of Robinson and Skyron, a real estate firm on Field Street. She was a salesman and she was the secretary. Her uncle, Jeff W. Robinson, was on vacation and requested that Mr. Culberson gave her a ride to work in the company-owned car in his absence. He picked her up from her home on Cedar Springs, where she lived with her parents, at 6 minutes before 8 that morning. Her father, a policeman who had a beat downtown, declined the offer to ride with them, stating, quote, I was sitting on the front porch, enjoying my pipe and reading the Dallas news. As I had 10 minutes before to go, I declined the invitation, telling them that I would go down on the streetcar. Florence waved her hand to me as they left, and I waved back, end quote. He never saw her alive again. Florence Brown and Mr. Culberson reached the office about 8:10. He did his duty, unlocked the front door, and turned on the switches. He told Florence he was going to the courthouse and then to the city hall, and we'd be back in 30 to 40 minutes. He returned 45 minutes later. The firm's partner and an employee walked in. The employee, Mr. G.W. Swore, went to the vault room and made the gruesome discovery. Florence Brown was lying on the floor with her face covered with blood. He said, "I raised Miss Brown up from the floor where she was lying and saw that her face was covered with blood and her hair was disheveled and her clothing torn. I called out to Mr. Styron, 'For heaven's sake, come here quick. Miss Florence has either cut herself or has been cut.'" Culberson ran to find a doctor and soon returned with Dr. Harden, who declared Miss Brown had been dead for around 15 minutes. She had been beaten on the head with a blunt instrument and her throat had been slit. Her right hand was cut to the bone and her clothing torn. Curiously, there is a bite mark on her right hand. Two bystanders later claimed they heard a muffled scream, a short, sharp cry from a woman, as if in terror or surprise, around 9:30 or 9:35. The murderer washed his hands in the sink, took the murder weapon with him, and calmly left the building and disappeared into the busy morning rush hour. The next morning, the morning news published sensational interior pictures of the office where Florence Brown was murdered. The first picture used an arrow to highlight the bloody wash basin where the murderer washed his hands. The next, the placid and well-appointed office where Florence breathed her last. The third photo featured the door from the main office to the private office where the murder took place. Finally, a star pinpointed where the body was found. Her funeral took place at McKinney Avenue Baptist Church at 4 o'clock on July 31st, 1913. Despite the oppressive heat, over 1,000 people crammed into the sanctuary. There were so many flowers that a second wagon was needed to transport them to Oakland Cemetery. A murder needs a motive. Either it is robbery or some other cause that motivates the criminal to kill. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Florence Brown did have the combination to the safe, but nothing was missing when the vault was opened several days later. A dragnet was thrown around North Texas, but the police had no idea of who or what they were searching for. All southbound trains and cars were searched, and Waxahachie police watched dirt roads leading into the city. The sheriff of Sherman notified his men to keep an eye on any stranger or suspicious character, with the result that stray people were picked up on dubious charges. The governor of Texas offered a reward of $250 for the capture and conviction of the murderer. The Dallas County Sheriff added another $150. That brought the total to $400, worth about $10,400 in today's currency. The day after the murder, Chief of Detectives Tanner stated he knew less than he did 24 hours earlier. As he stated, it may have been robbery and it may have been something worse, which prompted the cruel attack upon Miss Florence Brown. I'm rather inclined to think it was not robbery. It was quite apparent she was taken by surprise in the toilet room. The deed may have been committed by someone who knew her, or it may have been the work of some demented person. For days, every available person in the Dallas Police Department worked on the case. Detectives went to Brownwood, Sherwood, and San Antonio. The trails led nowhere. When Florence's uncle, Mr. Robinson, arrived from Colorado, he was confident he knew who murdered his niece. He declined to publicly state his suspicions because the investigation was ongoing. The police were also tight-lipped. There was a marriage license issued on February 20th, 1912, to a T.H. Hinkle and a Florence Brown. Apparently, this marriage never happened. Was this a stilted lover? A clue Mr. Robinson refused to publicly express? Once again, we probably will never know. The police speculated that Miss Brown had been affronted, she resented it, and she was murdered so that the insult would never be discovered. On August 7th, the case seemed to break. A peddler found a knife that the police believed they could connect to the murder. The blade had a fingerprint on it, and a chemist claimed the residue was blood. Maybe the assailant was even a woman because of the fingernail marks on her throat and hands, her messed up hair, a missing ring, and the tooth marks on her right hand, which were perhaps, quote, symbolic of the tactics generally pursued by women in personal encounters, end quote. The discovery of the knife proved to be a red herring. No arrests were made. Eventually, 4 suspects floated to the surface. Meat Bar was a prisoner in the Indiana Reformatory and claimed to have done the deed. When he testified in front of the grand jury, reporters observed a woman crying bitterly in the witness room. Both were charged with the crime. The woman's name was Mrs. Ellie M. Lake. She lived in an apartment complex on South Haskell, where Mead Bar's sister lived. Mrs. Lake announced her interest in Mead Bar was only to get him to stop drinking. She also rejected his advances and told him not to return unless her husband was there. She was eventually released, and so was Mead Bar. Barr was returned to the Indiana Penitentiary to finish out his prison sentence. He had been bored in prison, wrote a confession, and implicated his want-to-be lover, Mrs. Lake, for revenge. About a year after Florence's murder, another suspect emerged. An elderly woman came to the police and claimed that her son, Shad Feniel, had murdered 5 people, threatened her, and claimed to be the killer of Florence Brown. According to her tale, she and her son got on the streetcar to downtown the morning of the killing. She leased a house from Miss Brown's uncle, and gave Shad the money to pay the rent at the office where Miss Brown worked. Shad was reported later to have said, "They never will find out who did it." Shad Feniel was eventually found living by the state fairgrounds. Police surrounded the house on February 21st, 1915, and they had a shootout. Shad Feniel was killed, and Lieutenant Gunning was shot in the hand. He had to have 2 fingers amputated on his left hand. Dr. Priest Cheney, the dentist who made the plaster cast of the teeth marks on Florence Brown's arm, declared that Shad Feniel was not the murderer. His plaster teeth cast showed that the person who made the attack did not have a tooth on the upper right side of the mouth. Shad Feniel had a tooth missing on the left side, not the right, and therefore he could not be the killer. However, Chief Detective Tanner disagreed and felt they had gotten their man. An investigation by the grand jury found no credible evidence that Shad Feniel was the murderer. The police continued to look for suspects. 4 years after the murder, on July 30th, 1917, Felix Jones was charged with the killing of Florence Brown. He was being held in the El Paso jail awaiting trial for the murder of Thomas Lyons, a wealthy cattleman. A woman claimed to have been in the office the morning Miss Brown was killed. There was an angry stranger, possibly Mr. Jones, in the office. When she was asked to go to El Paso to identify Felix Jones as a stranger, she declined because of her poor health. Eventually, in September 1913, the case was dismissed because of the lack of evidence. Parades of clues kept coming. mainly from convicted criminals bored by jail time, looking for notoriety. A convict in the Texas penitentiary announced he had slain her to cover up questionable real estate transactions in Oklahoma. Another in Huntsville, Alabama, proclaimed that he was Florence's sweetheart. He had seen the killing, but had been silent all these years because he had been threatened with a revolver. As in a Shakespearean play, the drama intensified as the sagas continued and answers were sought. Lady Justice, however, refused to display her virtues. Despite the police's best efforts, the killers of Mrs. Hugh Perry and Miss Florence Brown were never found or identified. All of the police, once involved, are now on the other side of eternity. All of the files once kept by the police have disappeared. Their names and lives are largely forgotten today, but the questions continue. Who murdered Mrs. Hugh Perry and Miss Florence Brown? The answers are elusive and remain as one of Dallas's great unsolved murder mysteries. Thank you.
All right. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat as well for Renee to answer. See if we got any. All right. Well, I don't see any questions, so I guess that we'll thank Renee for the presentation. Very interesting, and interesting that they never found out. Who knows? Oh, we have a Q&A. What's the question? See, where are they buried?
Florence is buried in Oakland Cemetery, not the Oakland Cemetery. Oakland Cemetery, and Mrs. Perry is buried in the old Oak Cliff Cemetery up on A Street.
Okay, looks like we have another question here. How did you get interested in this topic?
I was doing research actually for the landmark designation for Christ Episcopal Church in Oak Cliff years ago, and I ran across this footnote, Mrs. Fry's diary, that she noted that a parishioner had been murdered, and that was my first clue that there was something going on. But it turned out to be a very interesting saga and continues to be. There are many unanswered questions about both murders, and curiously, all the records have disappeared. I called the Dallas Police Department. Of course, this is in the middle of COVID, and their records only go back to 1930. I called the city and called the county. They had nothing, and called the state, and they also could not find any information. I'm sure that those files are someplace in a dusty box, in somebody's attic somewhere.
Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. No. I have a question for you. How were you able to find all these different sources for the images and for the information that you presented tonight?
Dallas Morning News was a great source. The picture of Mrs. Perry was actually from the Dallas Times Herald, which is not yet digitalized, but I remember seeing it, and I called the library, and they were fantastic. They went ahead and retrieved it. At that time, the library was not open to anybody. Curiously, a lot of the sources, or some of the sources, came from ancestry.com. It's a wonderful resource to go and ferret out some of this stuff. And the State Baptist Archives, they were very helpful, and they did some digging also for me.
Great. Were there any, we got one more, we got somebody in the chat here. See, any relatives of either, I'm assuming, left here in Dallas?
As far as I know, there are not. Digging through ancestry.com, I could not find any close relatives, but or living relatives, but that may merit another search to see if I can identify them and find some more information about these two murders.
And then we have another question here. Was the McKinney Avenue Baptist Church where the Hard Rock was located?
Exactly. McKinney Avenue Baptist Church was morphed into the Hard Rock Cafe and eventually was torn down. Curiously, the dome survives in what later became Gaston Avenue Baptist Church over on Gaston Avenue.
Okay, let's see. Oh, we have a comment here that says Florence looks like Irene's great aunt and the wrecking bar. Okay. All right. Oh, we have one more here down here. Oh, there's a long one here. How common was it for murder of a middle-class people during that time? I would have thought there would have been a lot of people on the streets and mass transportation. It would have been unusual for a woman to have been alone on the streets.
That's a good question. It's not an easy answer. Mrs. Perry, Alice, excused herself from her sister and went shopping alone. And she was to meet with somebody. We don't know who that was. But two eyewitnesses later thought they saw her riding the streetcar dressed in her diamonds. As far as Florence Brown, she was alone in the office at the time of the murder. It was during rush hour. There were a lot of people on the streets. So it's a curious question. And I think perhaps our perception of events is that we think that they may have never been alone. And the reality was that they may have been by themselves more frequently than we think of.
Oh, McKinney Church was the wrecking bar. Architectural antiques before it became the Hard Rock Cafe. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay, let's see if we have any more. All right, well, it looks like all of the questions that we have for Renee. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And make sure to join us next week for our presentation on quote unquote modern jails in Dallas. Marcel Quimby will be presenting that for us next week. So be sure to tune in next Tuesday. And oh, we have one more in the chat here. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Renee.
Thanks, Terry.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And y'all have a good evening.